You know what? One quick aside before we get into the meat of this discussion. One of the reasons I wanted to try to produce this series in the first place is because it would allow me to express my creative psyche through shorter scripted content with an eye for quality over ad space. In a more practical sense, that would mean that 10-minute episodes for this series would be more of the exception than the rule. So with that in mind, what you can see what I originally intended to talk about was the subtitle from the Book of Saul, what it could possibly mean for the future of the franchise, and why, more than anything, it has me excited for that possibility. But that's all going to have to be saved for next week, because while I was writing the original script for this, I realized that my attempt to explain the big lesson from the original series wasn't really helping to place my excitement into context more than it was just making this whole project a lot longer. And you know, that in and of itself isn't entirely uncommon, as I tend to be a lot more long-winded than I really want to be, and ultimately, this means more content for you guys, so I guess we're just going to have to deal with it. With all that being said, let's jump right into it. So in order to understand the fanboy excitement for the upcoming spiral from the Book of Saul, as well as the potential future for the rest of the series, I think we're going to have to go all the way back to 2010 and the release of Saw 3D. Yep. At the time of its release, one of the biggest problems that I had with the ending was the underlying message from the shooting script. Thankfully, that was scrapped as much as they could in the final editing process, but unfortunately, it was just too ingrained into the narrative to be erased completely. Of course, I'm referring to the two unidentified assailants that helped Dr. Gordon take down Hoffman during the film's finale. You see, in the original script, we're led to believe that those two are not only supposed to be Brad and Ryan, first seen in the film's opening trap, but they, along with all the returning characters in Bobby Dagen's survival group, will in fact continue John's legacy. I hate this ending. I hate everything about this ending. It is the definition of a film or franchise insisting upon itself, while in reality it couldn't have been further from any logically coherent meaning. John's work was never supposed to be emulated by others, let alone every single person that he decided to test. Look, I'm not even saying this couldn't have been an interesting setup to bookend the entire series and leave the audience imagining what the reality might look like after the bombshell revelation. However, it could only be that if the series hadn't started to fully collapse into near self-parody, with an increasing number of one-note characters being introduced at the last minute to paint over rushed narrative arcs, all while sacrificing the series' core drama of would you, could you, should you do this specific thing in order to save your life or the life of your loved ones, and all of that in order to showcase more spectacular traps. Honestly, it was kind of a shit show. But that's just my opinion. One of the reasons I think this franchise holds up as well as it does is that intentionally or not, the entire series is about the broken philosophy of its main character and the bloody reality that it leaves in his wake. As every single film seems to shout that nobody in this entire fictional universe can be this guy. Nobody else can be as detached, fulfilled, clear-headed, competent, or meticulous as John Kramer at carrying forth the Jigsaw mythology. It doesn't matter how many people he recruits to carry on his work. It doesn't matter how many times he tries to test Amanda. It doesn't matter how many times he tries to course-correct Hoffman. It doesn't even matter if he parts ways with a former associate, because at some point, whoever it is will eventually use his methods for his or her own gain. Why? Well, it has less to do with the plot of each individual film and a lot with the overall theme of the franchise. For those of you who do not know, plot is basically the series of events and sequences of a story, while the theme is the overall message that the creator is trying to convey to the audience. So as where the plot usually requires a more detailed explanation for the audience to understand the point, the theme can usually be described in a simple sentence or two.
Nobody is reborn. It's all bullshit.
Yep.
Nobody changes unless they choose to change themselves. That doesn't usually come from a near-death experience, especially if they are orchestrated not by chance, but by design. John's particular set of circumstances and personal philosophies are what birthed his ideology when it comes to the Jigsaw Killer. But that doesn't mean that everyone, or even anyone for that matter, would be able to come to the same realization, no matter how hard you try to rig the specific set of events to trigger the same type of rebirth. At the end of the day, John's work is a failure. And I would argue that that's the realization that hit him at the end of the third film. As he lies on his deathbed, we see a solitary tear shed for the failure to cure Amanda of her demons or Jeff of his anger, and the results of which have already set into motion a path of destruction that not even he can plan for. It's an absolutely brutal finish for his character in the franchise, and one, if you think about it, makes everything that happens afterwards far more dark. John might have tried to help people, but he can't save Amanda. John might be a master planner, but he couldn't protect Jill in the afterlife from Hoffman, a creature that he created. He couldn't look that far ahead to see Logan picking back up the mantle in order to get revenge for his wife, and at least as far as we know right now, he cannot look beyond what was going to happen from the moment he died and the events of Spiral and all of these events and atrocities that are going to be put out in his name and his legacy. Stuff that he created thinking that he could change people, but slowly realizing that he just can't. And you know, on another note, that does kind of remind me exactly why Saw 3D is kind of the perfect anti-Saw movie, because when you really think about it, all it really is... Okay, you know what? This video is already long enough as it is, so we're just gonna have to cover that another time. Really, my point here is that the idea of the Jigsaw mythology, his entire legacy being continued indefinitely by a slew of new apprentices and old test subjects taking on the same mantle is, or at least was, kind of dumb around 2010. Almost to the level of self-parody, because the entire point of the series just simply can't be about that if everything else was pointed to the fact that nothing he ever thought about worked and everyone he tried to help ended up turning to their worst demons instead of finding any solace in his own methods. But you know what? That only really works if you're looking at a sequel from a very narrow perspective from the viewpoint of the original 7 films. And that's not what Spiral is. And when you really think about it, the groundwork for that was laid out in Jigsaw itself, despite the fact that that film was trying to act as a legitimate sequel to the original 7 films and even falling into a lot of the traps that we've talked about within this video. And that's what's really exciting about this movie. But we're going to have to talk about that next week. Until then, this has just been my take.